Hi everybody, welcome to the channel. I'm Jim. Today I'm going to start a series of videos on the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, his first autobiography. And we're going to read this Penguin Classics edition. Also, I have this at my side, my old teaching copy, my Dover thrift edition with my highlights and notes. And I would also point you to a website with a fine annotated edition. This is at frederickdouglasspapersproject.com. I'll leave a link in the show description, but you can read the whole book there. And a great advantage of that online edition, aside from accessibility, is it has really good notes. You can click on the notes and get some context about what's going on in the book. So that's very cool. I'm going to start this episode, and we're going to cover the preface, which includes two pieces by famous abolitionists, and then the first chapter of the narrative proper, written by Frederick Douglass. So let's jump into it. The first preface is by William Lloyd Garrison. And William Lloyd Garrison is one of the most famous abolitionists in the 19th century. Abolitionism was a movement to abolish chattel slavery in America. And it was quite radical for its time. And they had a huge influence. The whole purpose of the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass is it's basically like agitprop. So the book is a slave narrative. It's meant to go out to readers in the North and hopefully the South to show them, to demonstrate to them the evils of slavery. The abolitionists were morally opposed to slavery. They wanted to abolish it immediately. Some a little more gradually, some like Garrison wanted it to happen immediately, regardless of economic consequences. So this book by this escaped slave, Frederick Douglass, an African-American man, was a great opportunity to demonstrate to readers what was really going on below the Mason-Dixon line. And we'll get right into the preface by William Lloyd Garrison. He is an interesting character in his own right. But I think it's helpful to go through this preface because it sets the table. It gives you a sense of how the abolitionists wanted you to read this book. And it gets into some very important questions about authenticity, veracity, and so on. You also want to read this book, I think, with a bicameral mind. Like, read it for its relevance to our current contemporary moment, but also read it for its historical value. So this was a product of its time, mid-19th century. We're about 20 years before the Civil War breaks, or maybe 15 years before the Civil War breaks out. And slavery was on everyone's mind. And so you're going to see a lot of local contextual references to things. They're not complicated, but we'll mention them as we go along. So the preface starts with an anecdote. And here Garrison is saying, I first encountered Frederick Douglass in August of 1841 at an anti-slavery convention in Nantucket in New England. And this is where he met Frederick Douglass. And Douglass at the time was living in New Bedford, Massachusetts, where our book actually ends. He ends up there at the end of his narrative. This is his first autobiography. He wrote about 3. Okay, so Garrison then says, this was very fortunate to meet this guy. And because he's an incredible human being, he's really eloquent. He's very virtuous. He's a man of good character. And he says, I shall never forget his first speech at the convention, the extraordinary emotion it excited in my own mind, the powerful impression it created upon a crowded auditory, completely taken by surprise, and the applause which followed from the beginning to the end of his felicitous remarks. So he takes you right into that moment and describes that scene very vividly. You're there in the audience, everyone's like super impressed. And then he says, this is the key quote too. Actually, I'm going to show you my Dover notes because they're already highlighted. We won't cover all the highlights, but I think it's a little easier just for recording purposes. He says, I think I never hated slavery so intensely as at that moment. Certainly my perception of the enormous outrage which is inflicted by it on the godlike nature of its victims was rendered far more clear than ever. So this moment had an intense impact on Garrison. And here's why. Listen to the description. There stood one in physical proportion and stature, commanding and exact, in intellect richly endowed, in natural eloquence a prodigy, in soul manifestly created but a little lower than the angels, yet a slave, aye, a fugitive slave, trembling for his safety, hardly daring to believe that on the American soil a single white person could be found who would befriend him at all hazards, for the love of God and humanity, capable of high attainments as an intellectual and moral being, needing nothing but a comparatively small amount of cultivation to make him an ornament to society and a blessing to his race, by the law of the land, by the voice of the people, by the terms of the slave code. He was only a piece of property, a beast of burden, a chattel, personal, nevertheless. So what is Garrison doing there? He's saying, you couldn't ask for a more naturally eloquent, intelligent human being, capable, powerful, great stature, so much potential. And yet in the eyes of the law in America in the 19th century, he's a beast of burden. He's no better than cattle or a horse. And he's property. He's owned by someone else, and it's actually illegal for him to be here. So you can feel the juxtaposition and the moral outrage from Garrison. So at this meeting, Douglass told his story. He got up and he narrated his story, and he was very impressive. And at the end of this speech, this is what Garrison says. It was at once deeply impressed upon my mind that if Mr. Douglass could be persuaded to consecrate his time and talents to the promotion of the anti-slavery enterprise, a powerful impetus would be given to it and a stunning blow at the same time inflicted on Northern prejudice against a colored complexion. So he immediately sees the potential. We've got to talk him into joining our cause and being the mouthpiece for it, because no one's going to get across this story better than an actual escaped slave and someone of his capabilities. So he was apprehensive at first, Douglass was, understandably, not feeling like he might be up to the task of joining this cause. But he did consent to try to go out and make speeches at abolitionist meetings. And he began lecturing. What Garrison is also doing in this preface is he's trying to attest to Douglass's character. And I think of Aristotle, who wrote a very famous book called The Rhetoric. And part of that book is where he talks about rhetorical appeals. How do you convince an audience, whether they're listeners or readers, that you are credible, And how can you be persuasive to them? Well, there's different ways you can go about it. And one avenue is to build up what is called ethos, ethos. Ethos. That is sort of where we get the word ethics out of, and it really has to do with the character of the speaker. You want to come across, when you want to be persuasive, as authoritative, as credible, as honorable, as genuine, the real deal, a person of great character. Those are the people more likely to be trusted, according to Aristotle. And what Garrison is doing is he's taking this relative nobody, Frederick Douglass, and saying, you can trust this guy's incredible, and I'm bearing witness to that. So he says, he has borne himself with gentleness and meekness, yet with true manliness of character. He's a character witness. As a public speaker, he excels in pathos. Now, pathos is another of Aristotle's rhetorical appeals. It's interesting that Garrison brings it up there. He probably knew his Aristotle. Pathos is the appeal to emotions. So the one appeal, the ethos, is I'm a person of good character, moral integrity. You can trust me. I'm credible. I'm authoritative. Pathos has to do with I can make the emotional appeal. I can pull on your heartstrings. I can make you feel. And that is also very, very powerful. The third appeal, just to finish this out, I might as, since I'm on a sidetrack, is logos. Logos is the appeal to reason. So if you want to write or speak, that's another thing that's very convincing to people. It's like, this logically is sound. I have a well-reasoned argument, well-supported. You package those three things together, ethos, pathos, and logos, you usually have a winning combination. Okay, so Douglass excels in pathos, wit, comparison, imitation, strength of reasoning. That's the logos appeal. And fluency of language. There is in him that union of head and heart, which is indispensable to an enlightenment of the heads and a winning of the hearts of others. So this is all related to things that Aristotle has talked about before. Okay, so good guy, smart, reasonable, compassionate, can make the emotional appeal. He's brilliant. You can trust him. He's the real deal. And he says, it is certainly a very remarkable fact that one of the most efficient advocates of the slave population now before the public is a fugitive slave in the person of Frederick Douglass. And that the free colored population of the United States are as ably represented by one of their own number in the person of Charles Lennox Remond, whose eloquent appeals have extorted the highest applause of multitudes on both sides of the Atlantic. And then, by the way, who was Charles Lennox Remond? Let me see if I can pull that up on our website. He was the first black lecturer hired by any anti-slavery society. Now Garrison jumps into some rhetorical flourishes. He says, let the calumniators of the colored race despise themselves for their baseness and illiberality of spirit, and henceforth cease to talk of the natural inferiority of those who require nothing but time and opportunity to attain to the highest point of human excellence. So what is he saying there? Pro-slavery people will make the argument that these Negroes are naturally inferior. Are these people naturally inferior? Garrison is saying, no way. The problem is they are inferior, but the problem is they're not allowed to develop their full potential because they're slaves, because they've been not denied their humanity and all kinds of civil rights. Okay, and that's going to be a running theme throughout Douglass's narrative. And I'm going to try to point it out as we go along here. The natural inferiority argument is not true. He says, as continuing on here, it may perhaps be fairly questioned whether any other portion of the population of the earth could have endured the privations, sufferings, and horrors of slavery without having become more degraded in the scale of humanity than the slaves of African descent. Nothing has been left undone to cripple their intellects, darken their minds, debase their moral nature, obliterate all traces of their relationship to mankind, and yet how wonderfully they have sustained the mighty load of a most frightful bondage under which they have been groaning for centuries. You're taking this population based on race, and you're saying, we're going to deny you your humanity, and yet these people have survived, right? That is a moral argument, that Garrison's making too. And it's an argument that Douglass is going to make in his narrative, is that just give people a chance at equal opportunity and they will show you what they're capable of. Don't presume that anyone is inferior. And jumping down a little bit, he's attesting to Douglass's style. And you're going to see a big style between the writers of the preface and Douglass as a writer. I think you pick that up as soon as you get to chapter 1. But here is Garrison's take. He says he has very properly chosen to write his own narrative in his own style and according to the best of his ability rather than to employ someone else. He didn't hire a ghostwriter. This has to be his story told in his own way. It is therefore entirely his own production, and considering how long and dark was the career he had to run as a slave, how few have been his opportunities to improve his mind since he broke his iron fetters, it is, in my judgment, highly creditable to his head and heart. Okay? It's really important, let me put it this way, it's really important that this man tell his own story. This is like documentary history. And it can't be filtered through someone else's style, like a white educated person's style. This is a self-educated man telling his own. So you're going to find he's like super eloquent. Like you would never know that he was just self-educated. Like he's that good, that smart. But authenticity is a big, big theme in this book. Also, veracity. This book, now I told you at the outset, you could look at it as a piece of propaganda, but not all propaganda is false. It's not always false advertising. This is an advertisement for abolitionist thought, like the abolitionism, but at the same time, it's a true story. So, truth is a huge motif in the book. And listen to Garrison talk about that. I am confident that it is essentially true in all its statements Nothing has been set down in malice, nothing exaggerated, nothing drawn from the imagination that it comes short of the reality rather than overstates a single fact in regard to slavery as it is. It's essential that he write this book saying this is how it really is. Because if you embellish it and you make up details, you distort facts, you're going to get caught in those lies, and it's going to explode your ethos. No one will trust you if you make stuff up. So it's very important. And he says, the experience of Frederick Douglass as a slave was not a peculiar one. His lot was not especially a hard one. And this is an interesting point, too, that I think both prefaces make. His case may be regarded as a very fair specimen of the treatment of slaves in Maryland. So Douglass comes from the eastern shore of Maryland, the eastern side of the Chesapeake Bay. And this is a place in which state it is conceded that they are better fed and less cruelly treated than in Georgia, Alabama, or Louisiana. So in the deep South, the slaves have it even worse, like much, much worse. So we're going to give you an example of a guy who's writing about his slave experience from one of the better slave-owning states. And you'll find out better doesn't mean good. Many have suffered incomparably more, while very few on the plantations have suffered less than himself. Yet, how deplorable was his situation? What terrible chastisements were inflicted upon his person? What still more shocking outrages were perpetrated upon his mind? And then Garrison goes on. He waxes on. He tends to overwrite here, but he's making his case. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit and lead you to the end of this preface. The more, it's really like Garrison's rhetoric is one of moral outrage. Like, he just can't contain his anger and outrage at the slaveholders and the people who carry water for it. And the problem here is one of ignorance. And I want to write this down on the whiteboard too. As a binary. Ignorance, the flip side of which is knowledge. Okay, one of the problems he points out here in the preface is that the readers, and this is a book for white readers, North and South, but primarily probably the North, because I don't think this book would even get distributed in the South. It'd have to be done in secret. He says, so profoundly ignorant of the nature of slavery are many persons that they are stubbornly incredulous whenever they read or listen to any recital of the cruelties which are daily inflicted upon its victims. People just don't really know what's happening, right? This book is meant to fill that void. They do not deny that the slaves are held as property, but that terrible fact seems to convey to their minds that no idea of injustice, exposure to outrage, or savage barbarity. Tell them of cruel scourgings, of mutilations and brandings, of scenes of pollution and blood, of the banishment of all light and knowledge, and they affect to be greatly indignant at such enormous exaggerations, such wholesale misstatements, such abominable libels on the character of the Southern planters, as if all these direful outrages were not the natural results of slavery, as if it were less cruel to reduce a human being to the condition of a thing than to give him a severe flagellation or to deprive him of necessary food and clothing. As if whips, chains, thumb screws, paddles, bloodhounds, overseers, drivers, patrols were not all indispensable to keep the slaves down and to give protection to their ruthless oppressors. As if, when the marriage institution is abolished, concubinage, adultery, and incest must not necessarily abound. When all the rights of humanity are annihilated, any barrier remains to protect the victim from the fury of the spoiler. When absolute power is assumed over life and liberty, it will not be wielded with destructive sway. Skeptics of this character abound in society. In some few instances, their incredulity arises from a want of reflection, but generally it indicates a hatred of the light, a desire to shield slavery from the assaults of its foes, a contempt of the colored race, whether bond or free. Such will try to discredit the shocking tales of slaveholding cruelty, which are recorded in this truthful narrative, but they will labor in vain. So I'll finish this in a second, but what he's saying is, on the other side, the pro-slavery people, the best way for them to counter-argue against this book is to say it's not as bad as all that, or he's making stuff up, he's embellishing, he's making it sound worse than it really is. Mr. Douglass has frankly disclosed the place of his birth, the names of those who claimed ownership in his body and soul, and the names also of those who committed the crimes which he has alleged against them. His statements, therefore, may easily be disproved if they are untrue. So Garrison is daring people to prove Douglass wrong. He has named names, named places. You're going to find this all throughout the book. And that's important because he's trying to establish his ethos. He needs to tell the truth and keep it real. Because as soon as he's caught in a lie, the whole thing collapses. Okay, so we're going to move on from the preface to the second preface, and I'll spend less time on this. This is by another famous abolitionist, Wendell Phillips. And you'll notice a difference in style here. So Phillips is writing a letter to his friend, Frederick Douglass, and it's much more personalized, it's shorter, and it's not as like rhetorical as the Garrison stuff, which just sounds like he's orating, right? Here he's saying, it's time now for the lions to write history. So he refers to a fable of the man and the lion, where the lion complained that he should not be so misrepresented when the lions wrote history. Well, now it's the lions' turn to write history. That is the slaves. It's their turn. We have been left long enough to gather the character of slavery from the involuntary evidence of the masters. That's one side of the story. Now you're going to get the other side. And he makes references to different passages in Douglass's narrative, which we'll come across soon. I was glad to learn in your story how early the most neglected of God's children waken to a sense of their rights and of the injustice done them. Experience as a keen teacher, and long before you had mastered your ABC or knew where the white sails of the Chesapeake were bound, you began, I see, to gauge the wretchedness of the slave, not by his hunger and want, not by his lashes and toil, but by the cruel and blighting death which gathers over his soul. Okay. You come from that part of the country where we are told slavery appears with its fairest features. This is what Garrison was also talking about. Maryland, the slaves didn't have it quite as bad as they did in the Deep South. Let us hear then what it is at its best estate. Gaze on its bright side, if it has one. And then imagination may task her powers to add dark lines to the picture as she travels southward to that valley of the shadow of death, where the Mississippi sweeps along. A lot of biblical allusions in this book. That's no surprise. Everyone was steeped in the Bible back then. Again, attesting to Douglass's ethos, we have known you long and can put the most entire confidence in your truth, candor, and sincerity. Everyone who has heard you speak has felt, and I am confident everyone who reads your book will feel persuaded that you give them a fair specimen of the whole truth. No one-sided portrait, no wholesale complaints, but strict justice done. Okay, more of what, this is what Garrison was doing too, attesting to his character. And then this also refers at the end, I won't really quote this, but he's talking about the fugitive slave laws. And the laws on the book, as I understand them, were that if a slave escaped to the north, people were compelled to return those slaves. They could not harbor those slaves. And there were bounty hunters, and it was against the law to keep a fugitive slave, right? And this is partly the local context of this book, where they're agitating against that. Because if you can, in the northern states especially, like if you could get those laws off the books, then it's a real impetus for slaves to escape, because they know they won't be kidnapped and returned for bounties back to the South. So Wendell Phillips is making the point that Douglass really isn't safe. No matter where he is in America, he's always got to watch his back, even in Massachusetts. And in Douglass's own history, like he did actually like flee to, I think it was England. He spent some time over there until someone actually bought his freedom. And then once he was paid off, like Douglass could come back and not fear being returned to his master. Okay, so those are the prefaces. Let's now move on to chapter 1. It's a short chapter. We're going to get the ball rolling. First, what I want you to notice is the change in style, like how Douglass is much more direct, more plain-spoken, but no less intelligent than Phillips and Garrison. And it starts at the beginning with his birth. But I want you to look at this first paragraph and think about what's different about a slave's birth compared to a white person's birth. I was born in Tuckahoe near Hillsborough and about 12 miles from Easton in Talbot County, Maryland. Notice the specifics. You can literally get out a map. I've done this, and you can locate with some precision exactly where Douglass was born, where he was raised, where he was moved to, different plantations, and so forth. And there's a really good website that you can do an auto tour of these historical markers in the Eastern Shore that are associated with Douglass's life. I'll leave that link in the show description. I'd like to take that tour someday myself. I'm not too far away from these places. Something jumped out to me right away that's different. I have no accurate knowledge of my age, never having seen any authentic record containing it. They didn't keep such records for slaves because it didn't matter, because the owners didn't think they were people. By far the larger part of the slaves know as little of their ages as horses know of theirs, and it is the wish of most masters within my knowledge to keep their slaves thus ignorant. So there's our ignorance theme coming back, right? If you want power over someone, keep them ignorant. And it starts early, like not even knowing what your birthday is. I do not remember to have ever met a slave who could tell of his birthday. And he said, he's basically telling you right here, a want of information concerning my own was a source of unhappiness to me, even during childhood. The white children could tell their ages. I could not tell why I ought to be deprived of the same privilege. I was not allowed to make any inquiries. He deemed all such, I was not allowed to make any inquiries of my master concerning it. He deemed all such inquiries on the part of a slave improper and impertinent. We're going to come back to this theme again. And evidence of a restless spirit. And he gives you a rough estimate of how old he is. He thinks he was born around 1835. We do know his mother's name, Harriet Bailey, some of her genealogy. Douglass's father was a white man, probably the master, but no one admitted to it. Another thing that was denied him, and this is what I want you to compare with the way the slaves were brought up versus the white people, is a lot of denial of rights and privileges. So you're denied knowing what your birth date is. You're also denied access to your parent. My mother and I were separated when I was but an infant before I knew her as my mother. And that's a common custom for the children to be parted from their mothers at a young age. The child will be placed under the care of an old woman, someone who's been kind of retired out to pasture. Douglass claims to not know why this separation is done. I think we know why. Well, he suggests it too, unless it be to hinder the development of the child's affection towards its mother and to blunt and destroy the natural affection of the mother for the child. Nature is a theme in this book. What is natural? There is a natural affinity for a child and its mother, for a mother and its child. But slaveholders need to abolish that. He's only seen his mother 4 or 5 times. The mother would walk miles in the middle of the night to visit with her baby. And then we have Douglass sort of teaching us about the status of children of white masters and slave mothers. The mulatto children is really what he's taking up here. The fact remains that, and it's a law, that the children of slave women shall in all cases follow the condition of their mothers. If the father's white, doesn't matter. The child is a slave. The slave owner, in cases not a few, sustains to his slaves the double relation of master and father. And these slaves, these mulattoes, invariably suffer greater hardships and have more to contend with. Why? They are, in the first place, a constant offense to their mistress. So the master's wife, the mistress, she's going to notice and be pissed off and jealous, and then they're going to mistreat. They're going to treat those slaves harsher. They'll find fault with them. And the master is frequently compelled to sell this class of his slaves out of deference to the feelings of his white wife. So, this is just so messed up. Slavery is such a messed up institution. Don't even get me started. And this is Douglass's job, is to point out these horrible contradictions and ironies. So sometimes the master has to whip his own son. And then a little bit farther down here in the chapter, he talks about his early masters. The first was Anthony. Everyone called him Captain Anthony. And the overseer's name was Mr. Plummer, who was a monster, a savage monster. Master was not a humane slaveholder. It required extraordinary barbarity on the part of an overseer to affect him. He was a cruel man, hardened by a long life of slaveholding. He would at times seem to take great pleasure in whipping a slave. And we're getting into some horrible violence here. Trigger alert. And he's going to come up with the story of his aunt Hester, who was whipped. He sort of summarizes that experience up here, and then over here he's going to talk about the actual scene. And remember, Douglass is a little child still. He witnesses this, and he doesn't have any idea what's going on. Aunt Hester went out one night and happened to be absent when my master desired her presence. He had ordered her not to go out with evenings, but she was kind of seeing this young slave named Ned Roberts. And we can assume that the master wanted Aunt Hester for himself and was jealous, right? So she wasn't allowed to see him, but she did go out to see him. And, she was a good-looking lady, and she disobeyed the orders and had been found in company with Lloyd's Ned. And then this is all, something that Douglass realized when he watched her getting whipped and listened to it. Before he commenced whipping Aunt Hester, he took her into the kitchen and stripped her from neck to waist, leaving her neck, shoulders, and back entirely naked. And he then told her to cross her hands, calling her at the same time a DB. You can fill in the blanks there. After crossing her hands, he tied them with a strong rope and led her to a stool under a large hook in the joist put in for the purpose. Notice the details. Very direct, very descriptive. You can visualize it. He made her get up upon the stool and tied her hands to the hook. She now stood fair for his infernal purpose. His arms were stretched up at their full length so that she stood upon the ends of her toes. He then said to her, "Now you DB. I'll learn you how to disobey my orders." And then he commences to lay on the cowskin, and she's shrieking. And the little boy, Douglass, is terrified and horror-stricken, and he hides in the closet until it's over. And he expected that it would be his turn next. "This was all new to me," he says. "I had never seen anything like it before. I had always lived with my grandmother on the outskirts of the plantation where she was put to raise the children of the younger children. I had therefore been until now out of the way of the bloody scenes that had often occurred on a plantation." But this is his initiation into the cruel world of slavery, and it's not the end of it. So that's chapter 1. Next, I want to cover, I think we'll do chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5. These are all short chapters except for one chapter later in the book. So 2, 3, 4, and 5 is what I want to cover next. We're going to learn more about his young boy slave experiences, more place names, more character studies of the slave owners, and so forth. Check out that website, and you can dig into the notes in more detail. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next episode.